charging as if it is more than a toaster until you mess up, and then you want me to change my viewpoint on the animal that you were charging me accordingly to. It's such a good point.
And
But
it's not
go
enough
ahead.
to just give you back the money you paid in, because you get nothing then for that bond. It's like, okay, so you're basically going to pay me back all the money I paid you to make a mistake. No, that's not enough
Right.
either, because there's no disincentive. But what I also see, and this is the part that makes me really upset, is that not every veterinarian does things, pure of heart. I mean, and I guess that's the question, is that you have to understand that veterinarians are very highly revered practice. They're usually very well liked, not like attorneys. Attorneys, take attorneys to court, they're probably not going to do so well if they're the defendant. But I mean, veterinarians, most people think, oh, well, you must love animals, so you certainly don't want to hurt them. But there are veterinarians that, for whatever reason, maybe they have decided they needed more money. Maybe they've crammed their practice full so that they could make more. We even have a veterinarian who removed a microchip from a stolen cat. So for and the microchips, they're like $30 to $60. The surgery to remove it was like, the whole shebang was close to like $1,000. So when you look at things like this and you realize that not everybody's acting pure of heart, and sometimes it's harder to convince others that that's the truth. It's that's what you're fighting when you're going into these cases, because you're fighting a system that doesn't necessarily want to change. You're like, oh, we don't want them considered anything more than property, but we do want your money, thank you. you know
Yeah.
but and then to say that you would ever bring your animal in. I mean, it's not like it's not that just breeders or show animals or what have you. It's not simply a market that's driving it to the extent of, oh gosh, we only want the purest bred animals. No, people like the animals they get at the shelter, and they are absolutely happy. They're treated like kings in their homes, and that should be understood and valued.
We have to start, preparing everybody. I think, we just had a case on here we talked about, I think last week we did a special with a pet guardian who lost his dog Glocky. I don't know if any of you heard about this story, but the pet passed away from heat exhaustion at a doggy daycare. And it was interesting. I'm kind of interested as to what Dr. Dodds would say about this. So the pet is taken to the veterinary hospital and passes away there. And the veterinarian said that, put the dog on ice as they do. And then when the owner asked to get a necropsy, they said they couldn't because the dog was on ice, and that now they can no longer do that.
That's not true.
Yeah.
Right. And so I questioned whether there was a relationship between the boarding facility and the veterinarian, and they were trying to hide it,
Mhm.
which to me seemed kind of really sad, because I don't think, not that this means it's doggy daycare intention was heat exhaustion. I think they just are ill prepared to handle it when it happened and how to prevent it. But now it's turned into so much more
Mhm.
once that veterinarian prevents him from finding out the actual cause of death. But it just, like, that's the kind of stuff that continues to go on, and I don't know how we stop it. So we have to start preparing people. You always want to get a necropsy,
Mhm.
right?
Always.
Like, you have to get it, if not to get the answers of
Yeah, for
whether it was.
heat stroke, can't see anything unless the animal had some abnormal or internal organ thing that made the dog susceptible to intravascular clotting, thrombosis, in other words, because of heat stroke. And necropsy is important, and the fact that it was on ice has nothing to do.
Yeah.
But if it was just stroke and a healthy, otherwise healthy animal, you wouldn't see anything.
Yeah. And I think that's it's not necessarily for that particular case, but making people aware that
Yeah, sure.
you have to ask for your records. You have to. I know
Right.
it's so hard when we're going through it, and you think, like Anna pointed out, most times people think their veterinarians went all the way through vet school and they love their animals. And I'm here to tell you, I worked for a veterinarian that did not like animals. I don't know why he was a vet. He hated animals. He couldn't stand them and complained all the time. Now, I obviously think that's the small percentage, but we do have these situations. So you have to be prepared every time. Get your records, ask questions, get a necropsy. You're just going to have to, because we don't have much without it, right?
Yeah, even if you don't get an answer from the necropsy, it shows that you took the reasonable steps to try to find out. And
Right.
Oh,
that's
no,
where
for sure,
it's
100%.
important.
Yeah, I didn't mean not.
Yeah.
Sometimes you won't find anything,
Right.
which is good, because that shows you that it was just heat stroke and not some other comorbidity that caused the animal.
Right.
It still doesn't change the fact that the animal is not with us anymore. You know, it's
Right,
still very sad.
Yeah, that's one thing
But
that
people still leave dogs in cars with it, right?
the other side,
They still do.
they'll often lean on whatever they can, and if they'll say, well, you didn't get a necropsy, so they might have had cancer for all we know. And
Yes.
as absurd as that may sound for an otherwise healthy animal, you know, it's something that you know, if you don't have that necropsy to show that nope, it wasn't that, you know, that somebody will try to use, and that's sad.
Which in this case, that's exactly what we could have ruled out, because we really do believe it's heat stroke. I don't think anyone is even questioning it, but it would have been, he was not an old dog, and had a recent health check not too far back. I want to say it was 6 months before he went in. So, I mean, everything points to heat stroke, but now they can't, the other side can argue it could have been anything. And so that's why these necropsies are so important, because, and sometimes they're going to show nothing, right? Sometimes they're
Right.
going to tell, and you're going to be able to go home and say, okay, it wasn't the veterinarian's fault. And that's going to,
a third of human autopsies and animal
nothing.
Yeah.
Third?
Yeah, about a third.
Wow. But it helps cases. It helps us kind of understand it. And like I said, sometimes it can help a pet parent just feel better, because
Sure.
I was speaking with Lori, is behind the scenes here helping out, but we were talking about why people in general, but particularly I see it a lot in my world, in my industry, pet related, whether it's veterinarian, doggy daycares, trainers, boarders, where they feel this weird feeling of lying because they don't want to tell the truth, because they're I'll give you an example. Boarding facilities are notorious for this, where the pet parent drops off the dog and the dog doesn't want to eat his dinner that night, so he doesn't eat the dinner, so the boarding facility just throws it away and tells the owner everything's fine and go about your day. And the reason they do that, and the only reason I'm bringing this up, is because I think on some levels as a society, we need to get better at accepting the truth and not putting blame on somebody. And the more we keep blaming people for things, like that's not the boarding facility's fault that the dog didn't want to eat, but because the pet parents spend an awful lot of time blaming. Well, what did you do to him? Why didn't he want to eat? He always eats. And then it just starts going, and I see it in this industry all the time. And it's difficult. The reason I know about that, Dr. Dodds, is I've had to retrain people that have come from other boarding facilities that we don't do that. We just explain to the pet parent. Sometimes they don't eat on their first night of boarding or whatever.
For sure.
But I feel like a lot of times that's why we have veterinarians and in the pet industry tend to lie. And I'm not making excuses for them, but I also want pet parents to know that collectively we should all kind of be able to accept the truth when it's given to us as well, and let that be sometimes, because it's not always someone's fault, right? I mean, sometimes dogs just die. They get older and they die, and it's not someone's fault. But I know that's kind of took us off track, but it's something I talked to Scott about recently, that this is such a hard thing for me to do this, to be part of Joey's legacy, because I don't want to give people more excuses to blame their veterinarians, but I also want it to stop the veterinary malpractice. So I'm in this middle ground place where it's difficult, because the emotions, as Dr. Dodds brought up, become so strong, and then you get tunnel vision, and and some people will go to their attorneys, right? And they'll just throw money, and they want the attorneys to just keep going and going and going and going and going and going when there's not anybody's
fault. You can suggest to the pet parent that they contact a practitioner, an animal, and have that animal communicator talk to the pet. And often the pet will say, hey, I was hurting. You didn't know. I didn't want you to know. I am very happy now, and I'm waiting to greet you again. You know, you can have situations like that where the pet will say, "Hey, I'm fine." Our cat was a big cat came in. We had a feral cat, and she wouldn't let anybody, me and my husband, but she would sleep on my neck at night. If Charles got up to go to the pillow, anyway, she chased all the feral cats out of the backyard, always. Giant black cat, and the black cat said, "Chase me," and it turned out it wasn't a cat at all. It was a coyote,
Oh, wow.
and it killed her.
Oh, no.
And a neighbor found her. I talked to the communicator and Sherry, her name. Hey, it was my fault. The cat, but it was the coyote. I'm fine.
Wow.
That sad?
Yeah.
I still think of her at night.
But
She had 3.5 years living with us, you know?
Yeah. It's just like I said, it's a hard emotional thing, and sometimes it leads us down the wrong paths.
Yeah.
And knowing all of what we can do, working with the right people, I think is important, because you do, Anna, I'm sure you've had cases, Dr. Dodds, I know you have had cases where it isn't veterinary malpractice. How do you
Right.
handle those, Anna, when someone comes to you and says, I know this is, and you've got a veterinarian telling you now? How do you handle those?
You just can't take, I mean, that's one of the reasons that, having professional malpractice, I mean, honestly, it doesn't really matter if it's like a veterinary malpractice, human malpractice, accounting, something, wherever you're dealing with professionals, you want another professional in that same industry to be reviewing it, because there's things you're not going to be able to know. Like, I won't know the details of what to look for in a veterinary record. But that's why, like, for us, the very first step in the screening of a case is to have those records reviewed. And, a lot of times people, will say the things like, like what we talked about at the beginning here of like, well, they told me this and that. And it's like, okay, well, we have a timeline. You write a timeline, and then we'll submit that with the records. But the first thing the vet's going to look at is the records, because on their own, in their own words, did they make a mistake? Did they do something that's actionable? And that's why, if there isn't, a breach of the standard of care that led to the damages, then we don't take the case. We can't. And,
Yeah.
we try to tell the people, that look, this is actually better, because you're not going to then spend money on your case trying to bring it to court. And when you don't really have a clear chance, and as hard as it is, you just sometimes have to accept, and that bad things sometimes happen, and it's not necessarily anybody's fault. But a lot of people that we've taken, we've gone to, veterinarians for the review. Sometimes the vets will explain to them what happened, and it may be like, a couple weeks or a month later, but they call back and they say, I appreciated that I had a chance to find out what happened. And sometimes it's just answers, that we need, maybe not even, that it was somebody's fault. So I totally see what you're saying there. And that's why, I think I come off a little harsh sometimes, because like the things I have seen, they've been through those screens. They've been through the screen of where, somebody did something wrong. And even if they did something wrong and it didn't cause your animal to die, like a lot of times we see it in cancer, where an animal had cancer and then the vet made a mistake, but it wasn't because of that mistake that the animal died. If it hurt them, or if it increased their pain or something, well, and yeah, well, we'll try to do something. But if it was just something, that was a mistake and it had no consequence, then it's not really something that you go forward on, because that's not the point of this. The point is to stop the bad vets. Because I think about the article, and I'm sure, Dr. Dodds has seen this article, but it's the one by Marty Becker, that says, vet confessions, I lied when a pet died. And that's one of the things I remember seeing kind of earlier on, when I started this, and thinking, gosh, I really hope that doesn't happen. But I do see that, I see that, that's where the bigger issues come in, like when you get concealment, like, because I know a lot of people ask questions about fraud, and it's like, fraud is very hard to prove. It's not the most, it's not the most common thing that you see in malpractice. It can happen, but it's usually covering up a mistake. It's usually after the fact. The only types of fraud we usually see are like, I shouldn't say it like that, because the courts are, they're reluctant to to allow cases to proceed on fraud, because they think that's, it's hard. Fraud, it's a big word, but it's usually when somebody, if they're advertising they can do things that they can't, or if they're, making really clear misrepresentations like, oh yeah, we're totally going to, do all these x-rays, and they don't do them, then that's different. That's fraud. That's intentionally telling you that they're doing something and they're not. It's not just a mistake. But
Yeah.
but with the mistakes, yeah, it's a hard, I guess a kind of a hard conversation, to have with the clients if there really wasn't something that the vets could have done, or that they did do everything that they could do. And even though it's hard
Yeah.
to hear right then, they do appreciate it later on.
Later on, and
Yeah.
and when you're talking about, it's the cancer that took them, not the mistake that took them.
Right.
And a lot of times people just, like we always talk about, they just want to blame, because if it's not the veterinarian's fault, then it's their fault, is how they feel. And they don't want it to be their fault, so they're going to find a way for it to be their fault. So, but if 40 other dogs would have had that same thing happen that didn't have cancer and didn't die, right? That's what you're saying. And then therefore it's not the veterinarian's fault. So it's interesting, because the one case that I have always talked about on this show, and why I always say I'm such a good person to do this show, is because I've been accused of negligence in my business, and it was horrible. And a dog had passed away that had a collapsing trachea and was very, very old and had a myriad of medical problems. And she came in for a bath, and then I guess later that night she had a stroke, and so the mom thought that we were the cause of it. And I showed her the video, and she said that because we bathed her dog in water, how we had the hose, that's what killed her dog. But 9,000 other dogs that I've bathed exactly the same way have never had a stroke at night. And I was trying to help her understand that, but emotions get in the way, and it's such a hard.
Like people have an elderly dachshund that has chronic cardiovascular for months and months and months, and all of a sudden she goes to the veterinarian for a checkup and passes out. She can't be. She was perfectly down the street to visit a neighbor just yesterday. I said, Fix Jr., the guy that was the marathon runner,